morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the final session of the Just Transition Research webinar series, Justice in a Low Carbon Transition. I am Dimitris Tevis, and I'm a professor of politics at Colorado State University and the co-director of the Center for Environmental Justice. The webinar series is organized by the Just Transition Research Collaborative and the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, with support from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. The JTRC started its work in 2018 under the leadership and coordination of Tunya Krause and Edward Morena, and these webinars are its third initiative. Today's session is the final one in a series that has discussed a range of different issues, including gender, workers, community-based action, and the question of finance. Common trends throughout the series has been the focus on both the global north and the global south, and the inclusion of different perspectives and voices. Through this process, we have sought to showcase how different but connected types of injustices need to be addressed through an intersectional and holistic lens. Our goal is to advance justice in climate policies and beyond, and make transition work for all, especially workers and frontline communities around the world. We are rounding off our series with a conversation on power and politics that will explore whether and how narratives of just transition have changed since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, and what more recent events like the COVID-19 pandemic and deepening political contestations around the world might mean for just transition in the future. I'm really honored to be joined by a number of people who have spent a lot of their lives working on just transition and justice. Before we start though, and I will introduce them before they make their first comments, I would like to clarify a few logistical items, housekeeping items. The session will be recorded and it will be on the UNRISD YouTube channel, where the previous ones are also posted if you want to catch up with them. On your Zoom screen, you will see a general chat and question and other box, an answer box. Please use the Q&A box to post questions to one or more of the panelists, and the chat box to put in any information or to say hello, which we strongly encourage. It'd be nice to see who you are. For the questions that are submitted, there is also the possibility to vote or like, and that will help us organize the questions and direct them to the appropriate panelists. And at the very end of the webinar, we are going to distribute a short survey tool instrument. We would appreciate it if you fill it in. It won't take more than a few seconds to do so. The webinar is organized into 4 rounds. The first 2 rounds involve comments by the panelists around 2 questions, 2 common themes or questions. We are then going to have a round of question and answer from the audience. So please start posting your questions as soon as you have them. And then we are going to close with a third set of comments, looking forward with respect to just transition. So let us move on to our conversation. I will introduce each of our panelists before their first round of comments. So the first issue we would like to explore is, from your vantage point, from your experiences, from your research and practice, have the narratives and politics of just transition changed in the past 5 years? And if so, have they changed in terms of ambition, inclusiveness, or issues they address? We will start with Anabella Rosemberg, who is currently the International Program Director at Greenpeace International, but probably better known in the just transition world for a previous work as the Environmental Policy Officer of the International Trade Union Confederation, where she coordinated the international trade union movement's policy on climate and other environmental issues, and led advocacy efforts in various intergovernmental processes that eventually led to the inclusion of just transition in the Paris Agreement. So Anabella, seeing just transition in the Paris Agreement, I presume, must have been an important moment in your work. How do you think narratives and proposals of just transition have changed over the years?
Thanks, Dimitris. And let me first say how pleased I am and how honored I am to join you and the panel, as well as many friends that I'm seeing in the participant list in this call. As you said, I mean, seeing just transition in the Paris Agreement was, yeah, not only a professional kind of landmark, but certainly a personal one, one that really, I guess, marked my life in terms of all the efforts that were done before, all the conversations and tears we spent on trying to get this conversation forward, which was never only about a concept, but it was certainly about the case of climate action and environmental action happening hand in hand with social justice. And trying to make that case in an environment, in my case, the international governance environment, that was extremely reluctant to accept that need, even as a need at the beginning. So when, I think it's from where I sit, I think it's important to acknowledge that the concept of just transition has been evolving, not only in the past 5 years, but we have to capture, I would say, a time length that is a bit longer, that, as I was saying, came from a space, I think, of almost ignorance or rejection of the need to connect environmental action with other societal needs, because that was seen as overburdening an already complex conversation, to one where I think over the years, and not without a lot of effort by many activists, certainly in two kinds of geographies. One, what happened a lot in the US, that Jin is certainly going to react to, because the movement around just transition in the US and North America is of a particular kind. And then what was happening, and there I was probably more involved in that international sphere of just transition conversations, more connected to global policy making around environmental governance. And there, and before I ran a sort of assessment, if you want, of what has happened in the past 5 years, just to say that I'm contributing to this with a lot of humility, because as you said, I'm now working in another kind of organization, I would say preaching to the convinced, when it comes to climate action, but certainly a space where a lot is still to be done to connect narratives still to that social justice ambition that we need to make. So do take my remarks more as sort of activist, convinced that this is the frame that we need to keep working on, so that we build a much stronger movement for justice across the board. Whether we're talking about environment or planetary boundaries, whether we're talking about social justice or other forms of inequalities, racial inequalities, gender aspects, or north-south discussions. I would, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but I would like to just put in the in this first round three sort of trends or things that I see, again, from this marginal seat in which I am when it comes to the conversation. One is that I clearly see that the concept went mainstream. Like that references to just transition as part of climate narratives notably have become the mainstream in most of what I call elite communications and international media. Of course, unions at the international level keep raising it on a permanent basis. But I would say that they, or we in my heart, have become almost like one more voice in a space where other actors, businesses, governments, NGOs refer to it. We've also seen multiple attempts, and I think this series of webinars show it as well, an attempt to strengthen the concept from intersectional approaches. So gender groups, racialized groups, visions also from grassroots groups in extractive countries. So we've seen several attempts, I would say, in the progressive spectrum of the movement to own it. But I would say that the narratives about just transition in, again, elite communications and mainstream media became much milder despite those attempts to a concept that sometimes is being treated without some of its I would say, radicality in terms of its push on human and labor rights, its push in terms of communities having a seat. So let's say the mainstreaming of the concept came along with a sort of stripping out of some of its radicality, I would say, from what I can see. A second trend is that in some places, it started to look real. And I think like examples like the Spanish coal exit is one where we can see that it became real, at least in the labor dimension of it and the territorial dimension of it. I don't think in some of those other intersectional approaches it cut through yet, but in some of its initial intentions, and now with the Danish announcement on oil, where there is a similar commitment, I mean, it looks like on some places where some governments are keen to go in an ambitious way, they are not leaving the concept outside. And in the case of Spain, there's real money, resources, conversations associated to making it happen. And my last point, though, is probably one of, I would not say regret, but because I would not say that this is an easy thing to do, much easier to say than to do. But I have not seen over the past few years and since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, something that I think we thought and we knew also that was needed is more active campaigning on just transition at the workplace level, where we need an organizing effort. I mean, like a few months ago, and just to give an example, and I will end there, is that we, in Greenpeace, I mean, with a couple of other NGO partners, we ran a survey over more than 1,000 fossil fuel workers in the UK, like rank and file workers, to understand better their expectations about the transition out. And 91% of them told us that they never heard about the concept. And that is not to say, oh, are they living in an egg? I think it's normal. Because it looks like a lot of the conversation on just transition, even in the union space, government space, business space, is kept at a policy level that is still not filtering through the actual needs and vocabulary of a much larger part of the population. So I will conclude by saying that the past 5 years, from my perspective, have shown that the narrative around just transition is more pertinent than ever, that the need for hope, the need for ambition is there, but I don't think we've managed yet to tackle some of the imbalances of power that prevents us from going farther in terms of winning bigger for the people we're trying to defend. So I still see the need for organizing much more around this concept so it becomes a reality. I'll stop there for the time being.
Thank you so much, Anabella, and thank you for bringing up the question of power, which is central to this webinar. I would like to turn now to Dinga Sikwebu, who is a researcher for special projects for the National Union of Metalworkers of South Africa. He was the union's education department director, where he coordinated the development of NUMSA's climate change and decarbonization policies. And more recently, he has organized NUMSA's International Conference on Renewable Energy and served on the steering committee of the Electricity Crisis Campaign, focusing on skyrocketing tariffs, load shedding, and blackouts. Dinga, great to have you here. Based on your experience, how have just transition debates unfolded in South Africa over the last 5 years? Do you see progress, and what is the state of affairs?
Thank you, Dimitri, and thank you to organizers of the webinar. And I think that I am looking forward to an important discussion and to benefit from the different experiences of those who are participating in the webinar. The first thing I would want to say is to agree to an extent to what Anabella has just said about the concept of a just transition and how it has evolved. What she was sketching is also my experience in South Africa. Firstly, the concept of just transition has come into vogue in South Africa in the last five years. The concept has found itself into government policies. It has also found itself into frameworks by business associations. In September this year, the cabinet in South Africa agreed to establish a presidential climate change coordinating commission, which will drive the implementation of just transition. And I don't have to bore the people. We can go into different policies that have included this question of a just transition. So I agree that the concept has become mainstream even in South Africa. I mean, having been pioneered by the union movement around 2011, it's difficult to be in discussions about low carbon, moving towards a low carbon economy without people noting the need for a just transition. The second thing I want to say is that we can talk about how the concept has evolved, how it has become mainstream, and how it's being stretched and extended. But for me, the last 5 years has revealed that whilst we're talking about the just transition and the concept and how to use it, is that there is also the making of what I call the unjust transition. So in South Africa, whilst there appears to be this convergence on the just transition, we see the making of an unjust transition. And I'll just give a few examples to illustrate this. Firstly, in 2011, the South African government launched a renewable energy procurement program. And this was to diversify South Africa's dependence on coal in the electricity supply industry towards a sort of renewable energy. Unfortunately, the program has been dominated by foreign multinational corporations, and the promises of building a renewable energy technology manufacturing sector has not materialized. And where we as labor looked for the creation of jobs, which is in the manufacturing of these technologies, what we saw is the importation, lock, stock, and barrel of technologies from through importation. So that's what we've seen. And some of the companies that renewable energy technology companies that were established have now sort of closed down because of the dominance of these big multinational corporations in the program. The second illustration of the making of the unjust transition for me is the nature of the contracts that have been signed, the power purchase agreements with the projects, 20-year agreements, and signed at a time when the prices of wind and solar were high. And what this has done is that it has made the introduction onto the grid of renewables very, very burdensome as it gets passed on to consumers. And we've seen the skyrocketing of electricity tariffs, something that has sort of led to companies saying that it's unaffordable to electricity supply, leading to retrenchments in some of the electricity intensive sectors. The third example, illustration I want to make is that what we've seen in the last few years is a migration of rich customers from the grid through embedded generation or through self-generation, leading to a death spiral of the electricity utility, and also robbing municipalities that distribute the electricity of revenue, which is important for cross-subsidization from rich customers to what I call poor households. And this for me is just a couple of examples of what has been happening parallel or alongside the convergence on the concept. And I think that it's important when we have this discussion to also not to forget this dual process that is happening. And this has been our experience here in South Africa.
Well, thank you, Dinga. It's a good way to alert us to the politics and dynamics of just transitions and unjust transitions. Let us now move from South Africa to Canada and hear from Adrian Martinez Kirkwood, who is a senior researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, where he focuses on international trade and climate policy. He's a member of several just transition research and advocacy networks, and is a public commentator on just transition issues in the Canadian context. Adrian, you have followed the just transition debate in Canada very closely. Can you notice any changes in terms of its ambition, its inclusiveness, or the issues that are being addressed?
Thanks, Dimitris, and thanks everyone for being here and allowing me to be part of this. Dinga and Anabella actually covered a lot of what I would have liked to say, so I'll just keep it brief and maybe add a few details about especially the Canadian experience. Although I should note, because we've heard already about South Africa, Anabella mentioned Spain and Denmark, we're also seeing the mainstreaming of just transition and all over the place. So Scotland now has this Just Transition Commission, New Zealand has a Just Transition Unit, Germany's Coal Commission is modeled in a similar way. And in Canada, we had a Just Transition Task Force that was formed to help manage Canada's transition away from coal power, from coal-fired electricity generation. And on the whole, this is, I guess, a win to see the mainstreaming of this term. The challenge is that the more the idea is taken up by different actors, the more diffused and sometimes confused the concept becomes. And so although this core idea of a just transition remains, this idea that we just need to consider workers in the transition away from fossil fuels towards a low carbon economy, what that actually looks like in practice can mean a lot of different things and is kind of moving in a lot of different directions. So what kind of counts as a just transition is getting bigger, or at least people who are laying claim to the term is getting broader. So that introduces both opportunities and challenges. So what we've seen in Canada, for example, is that the fact that the government has named just transition as a principle, as a priority, it provides a platform, it creates an opportunity for especially progressive activists to push for things like addressing environmental racism and other injustices, for looking at the inclusiveness of the workforce, especially in, for example, the natural resource sector. On the other hand, just transition has actually become quite popular with more, I guess, obstructionist politicians, because it's actually a very convenient excuse for not acting on climate change. If you're saying your priority is we just want to protect jobs, our priority is a smooth economic transition, that's often used in place of actually meaningful climate action. So there's a real challenge here. But one of the consequences of these two kind of competing versions of a just transition is that the compromise has actually not been a very good one. The compromise has been, in Canada at least, we see just transition policies which are transition out of the fossil fuel industry. So we have a new safety net for coal workers. We have retraining and other policies that are supposed to help people who are losing jobs, but we don't have a just transition into something better. So, you know, we're supporting people for a year, helping them get new skills, but there aren't new jobs for people to move into. It's only half of a transition. So that's the big piece that I'm seeing missing in Canada, but also around the world, is like there's a growing acknowledgement that we need to move away from fossil fuels, but there's not a commensurate investment in a diversified economy, at least in many places. And that leaves workers in limbo.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Now we're going to move a little bit south. We are going to hear from Jin Cha about the United States. Jin is an assistant professor at Occidental College's Urban and Environmental Policy Department and a fellow at Cornell University's Walker Institute. She's on the board of the Center on Race, Poverty and the Environment, Good Girls and Welcome Ideas. Her work focuses on environmental justice and just transition, how to transition to a low carbon economy in a way that protects workers and communities. She studies labor climate coalitions and the relationship between inequality and the climate crisis. Jin, it's great to have you here. The US has received a lot of attention because of the elections. How would you say mobilizations for just transitions and the Green New Deal have come along in the last few years?
Thank you, Dimitris, and thank you all for having me here today. One of the benefits of going last, I would say, is that Anabella, Dinga, and Adrian really laid out so brilliantly the topics that we're talking about in a way much better than I could have. So I'll just add a few specific US contexts. The first I would say is that it is true that just transition, I think, and Dimitris, you've done so much work in this region as well, has really expanded and become more mainstreamed in the US. I think that there are 2 points here two things I'd like to point out here. One is that, as Anabella mentioned, it is a result of a lot of work of environmental justice and climate justice advocates to integrate social and economic considerations into climate considerations. We have had a long history of really technocratic traditional environmental movements that have really focused only on decarbonization and to the exclusion of social and economic concerns. And as such, just transition was not considered necessarily a climate issue, but more of maybe an economic development issue. I think that has changed in the last 5 years, really due to the work of the climate and environmental justice movements. The other thing I would say is that as just transition has mainstreamed, and to your point, Dimitris, about the Green New Deal, is that we see this backlash against these terms, right? So now in a lot of parts of the US, the Green New Deal is really toxic. It's something that will turn people off immediately. Similarly, just transition, right? We have done some work in Kentucky where people will, asking about what does just transition mean to you? And the response that we have gotten more than once is that don't even use that term with me, right? I know exactly what you're saying. And to Dinga's point, I think some of it is based in the history of unjust transition in the US, right? In the US, and I think even globally, we have been unable to transition workers and communities away from declining industries. And so I do think that there is this real fear, particularly given the fact that we have virtually no safety net in the US, that what happens when we lose these jobs and what happens to these workers and communities. But I also think a large part of it is disingenuous, and I think is being used to derail climate action and to decouple climate action from economic and social considerations. So we have one strand that is saying, we just need to decarbonize as quickly as possible and we'll deal with the other stuff later, which I think is how climate policy has acted in the US for we could say the last 30 years or so. And that approach is largely unsuccessful. We do not have national meaningful climate policy because I think we are unable to integrate, to express why climate policies are important to people's material considerations. I think this is again changing. But I think what we're up against is that not only is just transition being used as the new form of greenwashing, but because we have this history of unjust transition, because we are largely unable to support workers and communities, we have to show how we will meaningfully change people's lives. And this is, I think, to Adrian's point about what are we transitioning into? And this is, I think, also as mentioned before, we need to really put labor standards, we need to put support for communities in climate policy. And until we're able to do that, I think just transition will become just another term that people have used to derail climate action, despite the great efforts that are being made to really integrate social and economic considerations into climate considerations.
Thank you so much, Jin. I'd like to remind before we go to the second round of comments, I would like to remind the audience that after the second round, we're going to have a question and answer period. So please place, and I've seen already a number of questions, but place your questions into the question and answer box. The second, I would like to ask you to reflect a bit on the main actors and forces who are driving key just transition narratives in your experience. Why is the lens of power and politics relevant? And some of you have already mentioned that. And what are the risks of ignoring power and politics? And I would like to start with Dinga and hear Dinga's insights on that.
All right, thanks, Dimitri. I think in line with what we've said about the concept being a contested one, it's possible to discern the key actors who are wanting to shape the course of the transition, and in doing so trying to give a certain imprint into what is meant by just the transition. And I just wanted maybe to talk about our experience, or my experience here in South Africa. I think what we found is that we didn't sort of appreciate the role of a utility that is coal dependent and that is dominant. And this sort of state-owned entity, and how it has connections and links to the political elite. Just for people who are not familiar with South Africa, we have a vertically integrated electricity utility called Eskom, state-owned. And historically, whenever there's been attempts to restructure electricity supply, publicly it endorses what the government says. But what we've discovered is that through political networks, it has the ability into the ruling party, into the state, and somehow it can slow, it can divert, it can push things in certain directions. And I think it's important for every national context to analyze the role of such companies. So I would say that Eskom has been an important player in the determining the pace of the transition. The second thing that emerged over the last couple of years is that there appeared to be a convergence between environmental climate justice groups in South Africa and the labor movement on the just transition. This happened around 2011 when we hosted COP17, and we seem to be finding each other. In the last few years, I would say 3 years, there have been public spats, and there have been, I think, strong divisions between the labor movement and environmental groups. And in the context of the promises of a transition not being fulfilled, what we've found is the just transition being used, I would say, by us, the union movement, to slow things down, understandably so. And this has sort of opened up sort of divisions between the labor movement and environmental groups. I think it's also important, thirdly, when we speak about the labor movement, sometimes we speak about it broadly, not to dissect the labor movement and talk about the different sections of the labor movement. And what we found is that there is, let's say, the coal miners, there are the electricity generation workers, but there are a lot of other industries that are somehow allied to these sectors who have an interest maybe in the status quo, in the slowing down of change. And I think that it's important to disaggregate these sections of the labor movement. The third point and the last one that I want to make about the key actors which the experience has sort of revealed is that a just transition is an international process, and the role of international players, whether in terms of financiers, whether it's multinational corporations, is an important factor, and that when you are in the global south, the ability to determine your path is somehow limited by your location in what I call the global division of labor, and this is somehow something that we don't speak about. So those are the sort of three important players that, in the course of doing the work in the last few years, have sort of come up as something that maybe we didn't consider very strongly when we were developing in 2011 the concept of a just transition.
Thank you, Dinga. We'll move on now to Adrian's comments, and then Meijin, and then Anabella, before we move into the question and answer period. So keep posting your questions. Adrian?
Thanks. Yeah, again, I can speak to the Canadian experience, and I'll say off the bat that one of the biggest differences from what Dinga's just described is that business, like the private sector, has really not been part of the just transition conversation here, which is not to say that the private sector doesn't have a big role to play in climate politics in Canada, but they just have been very quiet on this particular issue. Instead, we see kind of three main groups of actors. One is, of course, the labor movement. That's where that's kind of been the heart and the origin of the just transition movement in Canada and in much of the world. And the motive there is ultimately to basically protect unionized workers, but often unions have a broader agenda of just protecting workers in general, ensuring that their rights are protected, that their well-being is protected as we make this transition. The second major actor has been governments, especially in the last 5 years. Governments now adopting just transition language, and then to a lesser extent, just transition principles as part of their social and environmental policy agenda. And then the third major actor we're seeing, and this is a growing one, is environmental NGOs, activists, who are starting to link this idea of a just transition to a broader agenda of environmental justice and social change. So one good example of that recently, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic in Canada, there was a major campaign that brought together dozens of organizations called the Just Recovery for All campaign. And it established a bunch of principles for how Canada should respond to COVID in a just, inclusive, and sustainable way. And a lot of the principles outlined in that campaign were drawn from, or at least consistent with, a lot of the demands around just transition. So there's been a real effort on that kind of activist side to tie in just transition to these other issues, things like environmental racism, inequality more broadly, things like that. And then, like I said, business has not really been a big part of the just transition conversation. So it's really been those three actors have been the key ones in this context, at least. But power here matters. There's something that Anabella mentioned earlier, which was who owns the term just transition, because that is actually a relevant question, because whoever owns the term kind of determines its scope, determines its agenda. And that's really contested right now. So if it's unions that own the term, the priority has to be on protecting workers, first and foremost, especially those unionized workers who stand to lose jobs as a result of climate policies. It's the kind of traditional and also the narrowest definition of what a just transition could be. If it's this new kind of activist interpretation of just transition, it's part of a kind of radical transformation towards a more inclusive society. And although these two, they aren't incompatible, you can of course want to protect and ensure the well-being of workers today while also focusing on who gets jobs in 10 years. But it's a different focus for sure. Again, this kind of activist interpretation of a just transition is more about how do we ensure that, yeah, in 5, 10, 20 years, we have a lot of green jobs and the people doing those jobs are representative, especially of historically marginalized groups who are often excluded from the jobs in the fossil fuel industries that are being lost. So there are different considerations. And then if it's governments that own the term, which is kind of increasingly seems to be the case, I mentioned those few examples in places like Scotland, New Zealand, here in Canada as well, where governments have just put the label just transition on what would just normally be their social policies. So it can be a co-opting of the term without necessarily doing anything differently. In Canada's case, for example, we have an employment insurance system, like many countries do, and we already adjust the conditions of employment insurance based on, for example, local unemployment. So, a fossil fuel community that is going through a bust period and lost a lot of jobs was always able to get more social security than they would have normally. And now we're being told that's a just transition policy, but it's really just the same policy, even though there are some new pieces tacked on. So I think that's the biggest risk here when we talk about at least narrative power, is that if it is truly a mainstream term and it has been kind of co-opted in that sense, is it still a useful rallying cry? And I wonder, and Mijin can talk a bit more about this, is this part of the reason why we're seeing terms like a Green New Deal instead? Are we moving towards terms that are a bit more radical and have a bit more potential than just transition? And I don't think that's clear at this moment.
Thank you, Adrian. Mijin, that was a good segue.
That was an excellent segue. Thank you. I think what I would add is that, this idea of who owns a term, I think, is very important, but also this idea of power. I think in the US, one of the issues that we have is that the left or the center left is almost allergic to this idea of amassing power and using power, right? And until we can kind of come to terms with the fact that what we think of as the Democratic Party is actually a neoliberal institution, and willingly so, right? I think that we tend to think, we always get caught up in this conversation here that, oh no, this is the only way that we can move forward. But I think until we must accept that the Democratic Party as it is now is a willingly neoliberal institution. And so they were advancing neoliberal policies. And until we can kind of dismantle or change that direction, what we think of as just transition will be just these either co-opted into something that is actually not a just transition, or will be so narrow in scope as to not have any kind of meaningful impact. To Hadrian's point about the idea of a Green New Deal, I think the US context, I think, is important to remember that we are somewhat of a failed state. So we are unable to kind of support our workers and communities in general. So when we think of something transformative, it really is just kind of getting to the standard that many other developed countries have. So that to us is transformative, which is sad and terrible. But I think that to build that power, to move towards so I think for us, just transition must be transformative, because we're starting at a point that is so far behind that even to get to a basic standard of meeting people's basic material needs is transformative in this country. So to that extent, we must build the power to push for transformative change and not get distracted into these narrow technocratic wins. And so to that extent, I think the people that are driving the discussion are the ones that are, willing to grapple with this idea of power, of wielding power, of building power, and not really, making these compromises that will just continue to put us on this path towards neoliberalism. And so we could look at the Sunrise Movement, for instance, these youth movements that are asking for a Green New Deal, that are asking for more transformative policies. I think that's really where we need to see power building and power wielding happening.
Okay, thank you, Mijin. I'd like to also encourage the panelists. We have a lot of questions, and I don't know if we are going to get to all of them. Feel free to respond to them in writing. And we're going to hear Anabella's comments before we go into the question and answer component of the discussion today. Thank you, Mijin.
There is a massive amount of questions. And actually, my point was going to build on Mijin's side, because I would not add more actors. I think the landscape is pretty similar across the board, but more on this idea of power. I think you can go a certain length with narratives, but I think like what we're talking here is really the struggle for taking humanity out of extractivism, out of neoliberalism, and those will not happen just in a semantic space. This is a struggle about who pays. Who pays for destruction? Who pays for protecting the most vulnerable? Who pays for transitioning to a different future? Therefore, it is quite normal that there is pushback. It is quite normal that the status quo and the powers of the status quo are either not joining, or when using it, subverting it. Is in the logic of the system to try first to fight and ignore, but then when something picks up, to try to bring it in. I think that maybe this is telling more about us than about them. When I think about just transition as something, as a concept that we helped develop, I think it was also an attempt to build a different counterpower to the one we have, and one that was allowing labor and environmental justice groups and many others who are aligned on who must pay to come together and build a larger space. And hopefully with that, bringing many more groups and people with us. I don't think we're there yet. And I would also say that our adversaries are organizing much faster. And they are basically managing not only with just transition, but are building on despair and a sense of permanent loss in many of those communities. They're building on that to just take them away and say, well, actually, better don't believe in the problem. And actually even taking folks into a climate skeptic space, because it's painful for many workers. It's better to think that it doesn't exist than thinking that there is a transition coming where there's hardly any chance that their ideas or their expectations and needs are going to be met. Which takes me to something that I think it was Nora raised in the questions, which is why is that this is not picking up that much with workers? Part of it, I think, is about the willingness to take the risk and organize. But I think the other one is also about hope and which are the resorts of hope in our societies. I was reading a really interesting book from Andreas Malm on what he called fossil fascism. Fantastic book. I really encourage you to read it. And one of an element in his book was that there is, with the loss of consciousness, I mean, in his case, it was class consciousness, but actually with the loss of belonging to a larger group of society, we've also lost hope about the capacity of that larger group to change things. And with that, it became more and more difficult to believe that things can be transformed. And that, for me, it's also a call for, like, now going back to where I'm sitting, it's also a call for us to see value in different parts of the movement, winning things that are completely unrelated to climate. I mean, when we are winning big things for society that go in the sense of more humanity and a better share of the costs, we should be owning that as part of victories for a much larger movement, where Argentinian women are going to win abortion, when workers are going to be winning somewhere else a massive fight for some, I don't know, social progress or right. Those are all things that add up to a sense of belonging to a much larger progress in society. And I think that is something that is missing in us. We keep on thinking about those things in a very fragmented way, where actually our adversaries take them all together and build a narrative of them winning across the world, which is not necessarily the reality, but is painted in that way.
Thank you, Anabella. This is, well, I've been following the questions, and a number of you have already answered some of them, but I also encourage you to respond in writing, because I don't think we can handle all of them. And also some of the questions have been posted will be addressed during the last round of comments, particularly the present conjuncture and the impact of the COVID. But I would like to kind of bring together some of the questions, starting with Adrian, about the role of corporations, the politics of oil, and the long-term vision in Canada and perhaps beyond Canada, if you can comment on that.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned in my last comment, I was talking about how the kind of corporate sector has been quiet on the issue of just transition, but certainly not quiet in general. And there's been a pretty incredible corporate capture, and especially parts of Canada, by the oil industry. I mean, oil is certainly an important part of the Canadian economy. You know, it's 5 to 10% of GDP. So it's significant, but it's not you'd be amazed at culturally how important oil is to big parts of the country. And it's quite amazing actually when you compare a jurisdiction like Alberta, which is the main oil producing province in Canada, to a place like Texas, which is a major oil producer in the United States. I mean, it's interesting because Texas is in my from what I can gather, is actually been quite much more pragmatic when it comes to issues of energy. Yes, they're a big oil producer, big oil refiner. They're not trying to get off oil anytime soon. But Texas, the state of Texas is also a huge leader in renewable energy. It's simply because that's makes good economic sense. There's a lot of money to be made in renewables, and Texas is a good place for it. So you see both the corporate sector and governments in that part of the United States moving towards renewable energy, again, just because it makes sense. And you don't see that in big parts of Canada. Alberta has been deliberately obstructionist when it comes to renewable energy, and has made decisions like recently, the province invested $1.5 billion in shoring up a new pipeline that is probably not going to get built anyway, the Keystone XL pipeline. And the $1.5 billion for a pipeline, I mean, you can imagine how much more you could do with that money if you invested in just about anything else in that province that desperately needs diversification. So, and this is kind of a long example of just how much vested interest and how much power there is that the oil industry holds. But I think we are seeing that change. Probably not enough and probably not fast enough. But the big oil companies around the world are increasingly under fire. We're increasingly seeing, for example, lawsuits brought against them for the knowledge of climate change that these companies had and covered up. We haven't seen a lot of those lawsuits be successful yet, but I do feel like it's only a matter of time. We're starting to see major investors divest from fossil fuels, not just universities now. It's things like major pension plans and other major institutional investors moving away from fossil fuels. And you know, that kind of change is going to hurt those companies, and that changes the kind of political calculus as well. So it's, I guess in summary, that, you know, the corporate sector still has a huge and powerful role when it comes to climate politics in general, but that role is changing, and hopefully for the better.
Thank you, Adrian. A lot of interest in the role of corporations and whether there are benefit agreements in various countries. So I think that's an important topic for all of us to keep in mind. What is the role of corporations? How can corporations and the state actually be moved in the right direction? I would like to move on to Mijin and ask a question that has been raised. Have we learned anything from previous transitions? That's one question beyond just oil, if you can speak to that, but also if you want to talk a little bit about collaborations, because that's something you're interested in, collaboration across social movements, including workers, and something also that Anabella raised.
Thank you. Those are great questions. And I think maybe the collaboration question can address a lot of the other questions that I've been seeing in the Q&A, which have been great. And I think, you know, one issue is, I guess, I do think messaging is important, but I think that messaging has to, you know, communication, so people understanding what they're transitioning into, or, you know, how these jobs or how these efforts will make their lives better. I think that has to be coupled with multiracial, multi-class coalitions that are pushing for multiracial, multi-class policies. So for instance, if we look at, you know, in New York, the New York Renews Coalition, which is this massive coalition that includes labor, climate, community organizations, democracy organizations, and they push for what is the most, I would say, ambitious climate policy in the US. And they coupled it with environmental justice and climate justice concerns. So the bill that had the emissions reductions targets, for instance, not only established a just transition fund, but also was coupled with a just environmental justice bill, so that both had to pass in order for both of them to become law. And I think as we think about what we need for a just transition is this kind of broad scale, multiracial, multi-coalition, multi-class coalition, but also because the policies that come from these configurations actually can result in a just transition. So when you have a multiracial, multi-class coalition, the issues that you're concerned about are beyond just workers and beyond just climate. And that's what I think is needed. So it's not just that we, kind of message this in a way that is acceptable, but I think coupling that with actual action, so many especially in the US, we have such a history of unjust transitions. If we think about deindustrialization, if we think about manufacturing, that we are kind of beyond the point of just saying what needs to be done, but we really need to show that jobs can be created in regions where jobs that have been lost. And I think, the approach has to be from the ground up with a multiracial, multi-class coalition.
Thank you, Mijin. Anabella, one of the issues that has emerged in the questions and I think through the presentations is the fact that we need to communicate in the broad sense just transition, not just the language we use, but the alliances, the way we frame it. And you started speaking to that. I don't know if you can add to some thoughts on the subject.
Yes, and there are a massive amount of questions that got me also like, oh yeah, this is really interesting. Yeah, how we talk about this really matters, because I think it matters more than the concept itself. I think we really need to stick more to the intention that this concept had at its premises, like what was the conversation about, and this idea that not only we should not leave anyone behind, but actually those impacted have a voice in the future they have to shape, and how we make that happen. And now in a context of ecological collapse, what does it look like when impacted is just multiple layers? We all impacted at very different levels, some like the most marginalized, in a massive scale. So how we reconnect to that initial intention more than the actual concept, even if I would think that it's still a semantic battle that we need to take. We should not let concepts go once we've tried to put something on the table. There were, so how we do it, I think it's really important to listen. And I think it's the way in which we listen is very different depending on who you are in that debate. I think the labor movement has one amazing wealth, which is that organizing rank and file workers allows them, when we're open, to listen to what they're saying and organize based on that. For people in the AGO movement, as I'm saying, we're calling, we're polling, we're doing, like there are different ways of listening and different ways of organizing. But the important thing is to try to be open to the things that are resonating with those people that we're trying to support, and not be just full of assumptions of what they feel, need, or want. Because I think certainly in the green space, we're full of that, of lots of assumptions of what folks that are impacted by this transition think. There were a couple of other questions, Dimitris, if you allow me.
Yes.
One from Nicola on the on what's going on with the Spanish transition. I think it's an amazing example. It's very interesting. We have to see what ES are going to say, but it's very interesting from a timeline perspective. So how fast it went, from a consensus of the social forces perspective, the amount of investment that is very territorialized, the participatory nature of the investment, the fact that groups, cooperatives, workers, small business, social economy can organize and pitch for getting resources for revitalizing the economy, and the commitment to zero job impact, which is also pretty amazing. It's still just goal and needs to be built up, but it's certainly something that it's a very good basis to build on from what I see. Mauro was also asking about just transition in the South. And I think that is also something where research has been lacking in the book, Dimitris, that you, Ed, and Dunia co-wrote. There was a very interesting article about just transition thought from Argentina with the Vaca Muerta case, where what we could see is that unless we're able to challenge the development model that is based on extractivism, it's going to be very difficult to prevent the worst from happening and having to keep on funding transitions all along. And this takes me to the other sector that we never mentioned, which is industrial agriculture and the whole industrialized food systems, which are the other part of the climate challenge as well, and the biodiversity collapse. A sector where not only we have less amount of unionized workers, but also, again, the poorest and most vulnerable involved. In the North, migrant workers, undocumented workers, people that are racialized and discriminated. In the South, the deadliest sector of all. And that is also a sector that must change because the rate of degradation of our forest and land use is massive. So there is another huge bunch that is to be explored around that. I will end with one more question. There were several from Matthew that were super interesting in terms of job guarantees, for example, thought as an approach. I'm following that with lots of enthusiasm, all the thinking from Pavlina Cherneva and others about what a jobs guarantee approach could mean vis-a-vis the approach on universal income. I think it's a very interesting take. And one final one of what he said in terms of urgency, because yes, we are facing environmental collapse, and we know that often is put on the table as saying there's no time to think about transitions. But I think that sends us the worst possible signal, which is that we're going to walk into an environmental collapse not caring for each other. And I think we have a responsibility as part of the progressive movement to say, well, we have to try. We really definitively have to try. I mean, to show the best of ourselves, because if how humanity is going to respond to this terrible challenge is whomever can save itself, I think we're just sending all of the worst signals when it comes to what our future could be looking like. So yes, the timing challenge is terrible, but it's not terrible because of a just transition. It's terrible because of the powers opposing it. Yeah.
Thank you, Anabella. And Dinga, one of the issues that emerge, and which also connects to Anabella's reference to the Global South and others that were mentioned about the role of workers. How do you feel that workers and unions can, in a sense, stem the power of the corporate power in South Africa? And what about the challenge of collaboration between the Global North and the Global South, not only amongst unions, but between unions and other social movements?
Thanks, Dimitri. I do think that it is important to look at the role that different regions in the world can play in this struggle. And I know that sometimes we speak broadly and glibly about, the North and the South. And in some of our earlier discussions and in some of the fora that I sort of participated in, global fora, there were workers who are important to what we're discussing, but who were hardly there, and what their views and what they were capable of doing was not addressed. Now, I'm talking here, for instance, if you talk about where does the oil come from, and the sort of the Middle East and the oil workers, and the fact that there is a challenge of even sort of union organizing in some of the oil producing countries. So I think that when we speak about this, of the global union movement, we have to be also open to the fact that the movement has a very strong, has areas where it's not represented, and that those areas in the final analysis will count in what happens in this transition that we're talking about. The other thing that is important for me is this question of the relationship between workers in different parts of the world. I mean, I've been observing the emergence of a discourse on a sort of new Green Deal and how that's defined either in the US, in the European Union. And what we are asking is whether in the discussions in the North, some of the imbalances in power between the global North and the global South, are they factored in the construction of these perspectives on the new deals? And as I always say, that if we are to effect a transition in South Africa, issues about access to technologies, questions of intellectual property regimes are at the center. And unless we address these questions, not in the sort of United Nations, UNFCCC climate negotiations, but also what happens in the World Trade Organizations, and that we need to be working in all these tracks where power resides. And that I think workers in the North must also appreciate the fact that when we talk about a just transition, and I'm not saying that they don't, we are also talking about a complete overhaul of the world and trading and financial system. And unless that's it's at the center, some of the tensions that sometimes appear in the labor movement between the different components of the movement will persist, and we need to address those.
Thank you very much, Dinga. Thank you all for your questions. The panelists will also answer those questions in writing, and they can also get in touch with you afterwards. We're going to move to our last very brief comments, not more than 2 minutes from each one of the panelists. 2020 seems to mark a potential turning point. What do you make of this? What is necessary to develop stronger visions and policies for just transition in the future, and how can our collaborative contribute? There's a lot to cover here, but I ask you to limit your comments to 2 minutes. We'll start with me, Jin, then move on to Adrian, Dinga, and close with Anabella. I have a few comments to make afterwards. Please don't forget the evaluation form that will be circulated, and we'll close in a few minutes. Okay, thank you, all of you so far. Mijin?
Thank you, Dimitris, and thank you all for such a wonderful conversation. I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to learn from all of my colleagues, and there's so much richness in this discussion that I just feel like I've learned so much in the last hour than I have in maybe my whole career. I don't know. So what I would say is that, we are at a moment of, especially in the US, I'll speak to the US context of, we are at a really crucial moment. And I think, what we are really fighting against is this idea that we will be, anytime we push for anything that will be, against the neoliberal paradigm, that will be against the existing power structures, the response that we'll get is that at least it's not Trump, right? What I'm most concerned about as we move forward in 2021 is that we are fighting against, our metrics of what is successful have shifted from what we need to do to stop the worst impacts of the climate crisis and also actualize a just transition to the lowest common denominator of at least it's not Trump. And I think this is really something we have to fight against. And I think what we are seeing in terms of who's being appointed to the Biden cabinet, I am not that hopeful. But what I am hopeful about is that, this conversation is happening in many spaces. And the idea that what has become mainstreamed in the US is that there needs to be social and economic considerations into climate considerations. That is a huge win and a huge movement in terms of both discourse and also actual policies that we see coming about. So I think you're absolutely right, Dimitris. We are at a really crucial point now. And what we really need to focus and make sure that our attention is on actualizing a just transition, not just a transition, but a just transition. And we must fight for the just part. And without the justice part, I think there will be no transition, right? So without the justice part, there will be no transition. And the more that we can really marry and cement those two things together, I think the more successful the movement will be.
Thank you. Adrian?
Thanks. Yeah, I think the reason I think 2020 is such a crucial turning point is that a just transition is needed right now. It's no longer theoretical. We've been talking about just transition for a long time, but it's always been localized or contingent. We will need a just transition if we decide to phase out coal plants or whatever. But we're in a position now where there are millions of people out of work around the world. Economies are reeling, and we're in a position, every government is basically in a position of saying, how do we want to rebuild? What do we want our economy to look like moving forward, putting the past aside? And so we're making a lot of crucial decisions right now that should be informed by the kind of discussions we're having today. I mean, I'm reminded of Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, the idea that crises are moments of political and economic opportunity. And it's kind of crude to say in a public health crisis, but if we don't use this opportunity, someone else will. So that's, I think, really, this is a really crucial political moment. And I think especially about the fossil fuel industry right now, because the oil and gas industry is reeling. Demand has dropped. Prices were already declining before COVID started. And that means we've seen a decline in production, decline in investment, decline in employment. And there are a lot of countries, Canada included, that's making this decision right now of, do we rebuild this industry or do we just cut our losses and let it go? And that's a crucial decision, because those kinds of infrastructure decisions that we make today determine kind of our energy mix in 20, 30, and 40 years. So we need to make those decisions correctly now. And I'll just conclude by saying that in some respects, the hardest part here is already behind us. We've already suffered the crash, the part that no one wanted to have happen. We need to rebuild anyway. Let's rebuild in the right direction. Thank you, Adrian. Dinga, your thoughts?
All right. Thank you to everyone on the panel. I must say that I'm sometimes reluctant to talk about turning points. I've heard the word turning points too often, and what makes me reluctant to use the word turning point is the decimation that I've seen around in terms of job losses, and the fact that what has happened in 2020 in the context of the union movement is the intensification of anxiety and insecurity, and for that, unless there are definite policies to win concrete things and introduce some hope, things can go either way. So my view is that at a level of the perspective, it is important to ensure that the transformative nature of the transition that we talk about is maintained and asserted, but it is important also to see that a lot is needed to introduce hope through struggle, and to ensure that people who at the end of the day will ensure that this struggle and this transition happens have the confidence to do so. So that's yeah, how I feel at this point. Yeah.
Thank you, Dinga. It's great to hear that we need to face the future we want with our eyes wide open. Anabella?
Yeah, it's a lot, and I really thank you. I mean, Dimitris and all the colleagues on Unrest for convening this conversation. It's a pleasure. I don't know where I read it. I don't know who was that. I don't know if it was a SHIELD member, a fantastic philosopher, African philosopher that is thinking excellent concepts. Another reading recommendation, a SHIELD member. He lives in South Africa, by the way. He teaches there. I think he was saying something like the environmental collapse is a problem without constituency and without a vision when compared to previous challenges that humanity has faced. How we build the constituency for that problem, and who is it made of, and what are the visions of the future we want to create, is for me the next step in this conversation about just transition. And I think, like, for the collaborative, and I think we we need to start thinking together, by which means all these different groups in different levels, in different countries, start engaging in building up that vision of what our futures need to be looking like if we want to get out of this, so that we mobilize beyond the crisis. And it's not just because we have a problem, but also because there is a future out there that we really want to fight for. And that is a thing that I'm reeling for. I mean, like, what are the futures that we want to build together? Other than that, I think it was a pleasure. There are as many experts in the chat that here in the panel. So also massive thanks for those incredible questions and thoughts from you guys. Do know, for the ones that I know, that I'm missing you a lot. And I hope we have drinks, virtual drinks somewhere at some point. But yeah, thank you for this invitation. It was great.
Thank you, Anabella. Thank you all the panelists. It was really a very informative, a very heartfelt sharing of information. Thank you to all the participants. I'm just looking at the chat box and the questions, and there is a wealth of information, ideas, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of realism, and all that. This is our last webinar. We're going to draw lessons from the 6 webinars we have done and focus on our future activities. We want to thank the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for its support. We will follow this series up with a message to ask you how you can be involved, or whether you can be involved, and whether you're interested in being involved with our effort. And we hope to see you again, to collaborate with you, to encounter you again, whether it's over a drink or in some other space, as Anabella said. Thank you all so much, both the panelists and also the extraordinary group of participants.